he changed what at the time was a 12 to 16 hour day to an 8-hour day and doubled workers' salary. And everyone called him absolutely crazy. And then months later, the productivity went through the roof. So he proved everybody wrong. Is there a single thought how we can get a better narrative out? Because it seems to be it's a lot about communication. Just like any change and transformation project I've ever been in, it's 50% success is about communicating this right, talking to people, helping people, that everyone understands what actually is going on and what we want to do. Do we have hope for that?
Well, I think there's some hope. I do want to reinforce one thing that you said. Dov Froman, who was an Intel guy and one of the godfathers of Israeli high-tech industry, wrote a wonderful book called Leadership the Hard Way. And one of his first things is he said the average leader should have 50% unscheduled time. And he said kind of what you just said. He said leaders are paid to think and not to react. But the only problem I have, and I know we're not going to disagree about this, is it goes back to body language and so on. Communication per se, I'm not sure. Fierce listening, yes. You know, there was a wonderful one-liner. Well, I've heard a couple of versions of it, but the one I remember was Churchill's mother, who was an American, said, "I went to a dinner, and when you talked to Mr. Gladstone at the end of the conversation, you knew that he was the smartest person in the world. When I turned to my left and talked to Mr. Disraeli at the end of the conversation, you thought you were the smartest person in the world." And you know, I've heard other commentary like that. I mean, it's with two PMs, it makes it, you know, a little bit more powerful. But I watched it. I was not involved with the administration, so I'm not showing off. Bill Clinton was like that. Clinton, and I've heard junior people say it. I did sit next to him at dinner one time. He absolutely makes you feel as you're the only human being on earth. You have no idea that you're talking about a person who had 7,000 nuclear weapons, you know, at his command. He makes you feel good. So, and I don't want to even use words like genuine communication. I mean, we have to remember, first of all, that communication is two ways. And I've never even heard of a good training course in listening, but there's no reason why there shouldn't be one. And when I was writing something about listening a couple of years ago, I just went to Amazon and found 25 books, and I'm sure most of them aren't great, but on the topic of listening, you can break it down like neurosurgery, and you can probably not transform yourself, but you can get a little bit better. And back to the other topic, it is clear neurobiologically that women are better listeners than men. There's a wonderful little experiment. It was in a book, it was reported in a book called The Female Brain. And by day 3 after birth, the female baby is making 3 times more eye contact with her fellow human beings than the male is. And it is that Darwinian community thing, I believe. It is, I totally agree with you with, I don't know how to answer the question. You've got to care. It's the, you know, my guy who said he wanted his tombstone to say he cared. I've got to feel something about you as my fellow human being. I think I can communicate with negative vibes as well as I can with positive vibes. And so that's why I'm not willing to buy the word communication per se. I've got to have a couple of adjectives around it. I've got to, but my wife is always on my case if we're ever in a cab or an Uber, because I like to talk to taxi drivers. And she said to me one time, and this was, we were in Washington, D.C. She said, "Why do you always like to talk to taxi drivers?" And I said, "Susan, because they're much more interesting than you and I are. You know, you go to Washington, D.C., and half the taxi drivers are Ethiopian. They've gone through starvation. They've gone through revolution. They probably had a second cousin who was beheaded 3 blocks away from home. They know so much more about life than you and I do." And that's not a throwaway line. You know, it really is the case. I mean, the other thing I've said about that is if you have more than a 30-minute cab ride and you do not know the names of the cab driver's children and what years they are in school, I don't want to know you as a human being. I had a wonderful thing happened in London. I was doing something and a guy was driving me around. I felt honored because he also drove Mick Jagger, but he was driving me around and he looked at me at one point. He said, "You know, there are 2 kinds of people who sit in the back seat of this car." And I said, "Okay." He said, "There are people who remember their roots and there are people who think they deserve to be there." And, you know, I thought that most of life was explained with that single sentence. But, you know, give me the one who remembers their roots, and I think the communication will be different than from the one who thinks that he or she ought to be sitting in the back seat. And I don't know how we bring about change in that.